Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens, and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments.
Today, we embark on a journey through 5 millennia of one of the most majestic civilizations on our planet. In this video, we will trace the path from the mysterious cities of the Indus Valley with their ancient technologies to the modern superpower reaching for the moon. You will learn how the great teachings of Buddha and Mahavira were born, and why the powerful Emperor Ashoka suddenly traded the sword for the sermon of peace. We will uncover the secrets of the Golden Age, when Indian scientists gave the world the concept of zero, and admire the luxury of the great Mughals who erected the shining Taj Mahal. At the beginning of the 20th century, archaeologists made a discovery that forced humanity to completely reconsider its views on the development of civilization. In the valley of the Indus River, on the territories of modern Pakistan and northwestern India, traces were found of a culture that in its level of development far surpassed ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. This culture is called the Harappan or Indus civilization. Imagine the world 5,000 years ago. While most of humanity lived in huts and engaged in primitive gathering, the inhabitants of the Indus Valley were already building huge megacities from fired brick. The main centers of this culture were the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. When scientists first began excavations, they were amazed by the strict geometry of the streets. The cities were built according to a single plan. All streets intersected at right angles, forming clear blocks. This indicates that the people of that time had powerful centralized authority and deep knowledge of mathematics and geometry. Ancient builders paid special attention to comfort and hygiene. Each house had a separate bathing unit. Water was discharged through special channels into the city-wide sewer system. This was the first complex drainage network in human history, laid underground and covered with brick slabs. City residents used clean water from deep stone-lined wells. The level of sanitation in Mohenjo-daro was so high that similar systems appeared in Europe only several millennia later. The center of public life was a structure that modern researchers call the Great Bath. It was a huge reservoir built from tightly fitted bricks and covered with a layer of natural bitumen for complete waterproofing. Around the bath were galleries and rooms. Scientists suggest that ritual ablutions were performed here, which had sacred significance for all citizens. Purification by water may already have been an important part of the spiritual life of the ancestors of modern Indians. The economy of this civilization was based on agriculture and large-scale trade. The fertile floods of the Indus River allowed the cultivation of wheat, barley, and cotton. It was the Indus craftsmen who were the first in the world to learn how to spin and weave clothing from cotton. Harappa's trade links extended for thousands of kilometers. Archaeologists find stone seals with images of animals and mysterious writings in distant Sumer. This proves that Indus merchants equipped caravans and ships, crossing seas and deserts to exchange jewelry made of lapis lazuli, gold and fabrics for copper and valuable oils. The society of the Harappan civilization was surprisingly peaceful. Very little weapons are found during excavations. Instead, there is an abundance of children's toys, skillfully made jewelry, and standard weights for scales. The use of a unified system of measures and weights throughout the vast territory of the civilization confirms the presence of strict organization and honest rules of trade. Women wore complex hairstyles and massive bracelets, while men used seals with images of unicorns and buffaloes as personal signatures. One of the biggest mysteries remains the writing of the Indus Valley. Researchers have discovered thousands of short inscriptions on tablets and amulets, but no one has been able to decipher them yet. We see images of elephants, tigers, and strange mythical creatures surrounded by symbols, but we do not know what these people thought or what language they spoke. This silence makes the Harappan culture even more mysterious and attractive. The decline of this great civilization began about 3,900 years ago. It was not a sudden destruction by enemy invasion. The cities emptied gradually. Scientists propose several theories for this decline. One of the main reasons is considered to be climate change and devastating floods. The Indus River often changed its course, destroying dams and irrigation systems. Gradual drying of the lands made agriculture impossible. People began to leave their comfortable homes and move east and south toward the Ganges River basin. By 1700 BCE, the great cities had finally turned into ruins. However, the legacy of Harappa did not disappear without a trace. Many elements of their daily life, symbols and farming methods were preserved in the people's memory and passed down from generation to generation. The great civilization of the past prepared the ground for new cultural transformations that began with the arrival of other tribes and new ideas. The era of cities was replaced by the era of nomads and great hymns, but the foundation of Indian history was laid right here on the banks of the mighty Indus. Thus ended the first great stage, leaving behind only echoes in the form of the ruins of Mohenjo-daro and undeciphered writings that are still waiting for their discoverer. When the ancient cities in the Indus Valley finally became deserted, new tribes began to appear on the northwestern borders of the Indian subcontinent. These people called themselves Aryans, which in their language meant noble. They did not build stone cities or lay water pipes. The Aryans were nomads and cattle breeders whose way of life was inextricably linked with movement and the search for new pastures. They brought with them high speed of movement on light chariots drawn by horses and new knowledge about the use of bronze and copper. From this moment, a completely different era begins, which historians call the Vedic period. The main treasure of the Aryans was not gold or stones, but oral tradition. For centuries, they passed down sacred hymns, prayers, and spells from mouth to mouth. Later, this knowledge was collected into 4 great collections known as the Vedas. The earliest of them, the Rig Veda, is considered one of the oldest texts in the world. In these verses, the life of people who worship the forces of nature is described. They saw divine presence in fire, wind, the morning dawn, and thunder. Rituals were performed in the open air at the sacrificial fire, where priests threw grain and oil, invoking the favor of heavenly forces. Gradually, the Aryans advanced deeper into the country, mastering fertile lands. This process was not quick. Dense jungles had to be cleared with fire and new iron tools. With the transition to a sedentary lifestyle, society also changed. Instead of scattered nomadic clans, the first tribal unions and small principalities began to form. The power of the leader, called Raja, became more stable. Now he not only led warriors into battle, but also was responsible for order in the inhabited lands and the protection of accumulated wealth. It was during this period that a unique social system began to take shape, one that has no analogues in world history. Society was divided into 4 main groups called Varnas. Each group had strictly defined duties and rights. At the top of this pyramid were the Brahmins. These were priests, scholars, and keepers of sacred texts. Only they had the right to perform complex rituals and teach others the Vedas. The word of a Brahmin was considered sacred and his life inviolable. Brahmins acted as advisors to rulers and intellectual leaders of society. The second group were the Kshatriyas. This included kings, princes, and warriors. Their sacred duty was to protect the people and govern the state. Kshatriyas were supposed to possess courage, strength, and a sense of justice. All political power was in their hands, but spiritually they still submitted to the authority of the priests. The third group consisted of the Vaishyas. This was the most numerous stratum of free people. It included farmers, cattle breeders, and traders. Vaishyas ensured the economic prosperity of society by creating material goods. The fourth and lowest group were the Shudras. Their duty was to serve the representatives of the three higher Varnas. Mostly, these were people engaged in heavy physical labor and crafts. Later, this system became even more complex, dividing into thousands of smaller castes based on professional lines. A person was born into a certain caste and could not change their position during their lifetime. Transition from one group to another was considered impossible. This rigid division ensured the stability of society for thousands of years, but at the same time created deep inequality. The Vedic era gave India not only a social structure, but also the deepest philosophical ideas. In later texts known as the Upanishads, the focus shifted from external rituals to the inner world of man. The sages of that time began to ask questions about the nature of the soul and the origin of the universe. The concept of Brahman emerged as the absolute impersonal reality that permeates all existence. Parallel to this appeared the teaching of Atman, the immortal spark of life inside every living being. Philosophers asserted that the true goal of a person is to realize the unity of their soul with the world spirit. It was then that concepts were born that became the foundation of Indian worldview. The first is Dharma, the law of the righteous path and moral duty. Every person had to follow their Dharma in accordance with their origin and age. The second concept is karma, the law of cause and effect. According to this teaching, every action of a person, good or evil, inevitably leads to consequences in the future. Life began to be perceived as an endless cycle of births and deaths, called samsara. The main task of a wise person was considered to be liberation from this circle. Vedic civilization was a time of great poets and thinkers. Works were created in the Sanskrit language that are still studied all over the world. Sanskrit became the language of high culture and science, uniting educated people from different corners of the subcontinent. Although society was divided into estates, a common cultural space and unified mythology created a sense of belonging to a great tradition. Heroes of Vedic legends became role models, and their exploits were retold in every home. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, life in the Ganges Valley became prosperous and complex. Rich cities appeared, crafts developed, and the rituals of the priests became so intricate and expensive that they began to cause discontent among ordinary people. Brahmins accumulated enormous power, but their exclusive right to knowledge began to be questioned. Tension grew in society. People were looking for new answers to old questions about suffering, life, and death. This time became the harbinger of great spiritual changes that would forever change the face of India and the whole world. Thus ended the classical Vedic period. It left behind the caste system, the sacred language, Sanskrit, and great philosophical texts that formed the basis of the Indian spirit. The old era created a solid foundation on which new teachings soon grew, challenging the authority of the priests and offering a different path to salvation. India stood on the threshold of one of the brightest intellectual revolutions in its long history. By the 6th century BCE, life in the northern part of India had undergone significant changes. The Ganges River valley turned into a prosperous region where large cities replaced small settlements. The growth of trade and crafts led to the emergence of wealthy townspeople who did not belong to the higher estates of priests or warriors. At the same time, the old religious system began to face a serious crisis. Many people felt tired of the endless and expensive rituals performed by Brahmins. The teaching that only through complex sacrifices one could achieve the favor of the gods no longer satisfied searching minds. Society thirsted for answers to questions about the meaning of suffering and the possibility of personal salvation without intermediaries. In this atmosphere of spiritual quest, many wandering philosophers and ascetics appeared in India. They left the cities for deep forests to comprehend the truth through reflection and severe trials of the flesh. Among this variety of ideas, two teachings stood out that would forever change the country's cultural code. One of them was the teaching of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, and the other was the path of Siddhartha Gautama, who became known to the world as the Buddha. Both of these thinkers came from the warrior and ruler estate, but both decided to leave their palaces in search of spiritual liberation. Vardhamana Mahavira was a contemporary of these great changes. He was born into a noble family and lived 30 years in luxury before realizing the vanity of worldly life. Leaving his wife, daughter, and all his property, he became a wandering monk. For 12 years, Mahavira practiced the harshest asceticism, limiting himself in food, striving to completely subdue his senses and will. Having achieved enlightenment, he began to call himself Jina, which translates as conqueror. His teaching, Jainism, preached the path of ultimate purity and self-control. The main pillar of Jainism became the principle of ahimsa, absolute non-violence. Mahavira taught that any soul in the world is sacred and possesses consciousness. This applied not only to people and animals, but even to plants. Followers of Jainism tried not to harm any living being, neither by deed, nor by word, nor even by thought. They believed that every action leaves an imprint on the soul in the form of heavy matter of karma, which prevents a person from freeing themselves from endless rebirths. Only through asceticism, honesty, and compassion could one purify the soul and achieve eternal bliss. The ideas of ahimsa had a colossal influence on Indian ethics, and even 25 centuries later formed the basis of the philosophy of the struggle for independence. Almost at the same time, in the north of India, at the foot of the Himalayas, lived Prince Siddhartha Gautama. His father tried to protect his son from any knowledge of pain and death, creating for him an illusory world of eternal holiday behind the palace walls. However, fateful meetings with a sick man, an old man, and a funeral procession revealed to the prince the truth about the inevitability of human suffering. The fourth meeting with a calm and serene ascetic suggested the path to salvation. At the age of 29, Siddhartha secretly left home, shaved his long hair, and set off in search of truth. For many years he studied the wisdom of the Brahmins and exhausted his body with hunger until he realized that extremes do not lead to understanding. Sitting under a tree in the place called Bodh Gaya, he vowed not to rise until he found the answer to the question about the cause of suffering. At the end of the night, insight came to him. He understood that the root of all human troubles lies in his own endless desires and attachments. From that moment, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one. His first sermon in the deer park near the city of Varanasi laid the foundations of a new teaching that would later cover the entire East. The Buddha offered the world the middle path, a path without excesses and without painful asceticism. He formulated the Four Noble Truths, which describe the nature of suffering and the way to get rid of it through right thinking, right behavior, and meditation. Unlike the old Vedic system, Buddhism denied the importance of caste division. The Buddha asserted that a person's nobility is determined not by his birth, but by his actions. This made his teaching popular among the common people and merchants. Any person, regardless of social status, could join the monastic community and strive for nirvana, a state of complete peace and liberation from earthly burdens. The new spiritual movements contributed to the development of literacy and philosophy. Disciples recorded the words of their teachers on palm leaves, creating extensive canons. The first monasteries appeared, which became not only religious but also educational centers. In these abodes, heated debates were held about the nature of reality, time, and the infinity of the universe. The spiritual revolution even forced traditional Brahmins to reconsider their approaches, which led to the simplification of many rituals and the emergence of more personal forms of worship of deities. The influence of the Buddha and Mahavira went far beyond purely religious issues. Their teachings called for social justice, mercy, and each person's responsibility for their own destiny. Rulers of many small states began to listen to the advice of monks, realizing that peaceful coexistence of peoples and the prosperity of the country are impossible without observing moral laws. Along trade routes, shelters for travelers began to be built, and violence against animals gradually became limited. This era became a time of great intellectual ferment. People learned to think critically and seek truth within themselves rather than in external rituals. The 6th century BCE turned India into a real laboratory of ideas that later spread to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. The teachings of Jainism and Buddhism coexisted side by side, enriching Indian culture with art, architecture, and ethical norms. By the end of this period, India was ready for the next step, the creation of a single, powerful state. The spiritual unity laid down by the great teachers created the ground for the political unification of disparate lands. On the horizon, the shadow of a great empire was already rising. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, India was a patchwork of many warring kingdoms and tribal unions. In the west, the sound of the hooves of Alexander the Great's horses could already be heard, whose troops reached the banks of the Indus River. However, it was this external threat and internal chaos that pushed the country toward creating the first great empire in its history. The center of unification became the kingdom of Magadha, located in the fertile Ganges Valley. It was here that the history of the Maurya dynasty began. The founder of this power was a young and ambitious warrior named Chandragupta Maurya. Legends say that he was a man of humble origin, but possessed incredible willpower and leadership talent. His faithful ally and mentor was the wise Brahmin Chanakya. Together they developed a strategy to seize power, combining military force with subtle diplomacy and cunning. Chandragupta managed to overthrow the Nanda dynasty and expel the Greek garrisons left by Alexander. Thus was born an empire whose capital became the magnificent city of Pataliputra, one of the largest megacities of the ancient world. Managing such a huge state required iron discipline. Under Chandragupta, a complex administrative system was created. The country was divided into provinces governed by governors from the royal family. A unified tax system was introduced, and for maintaining order, a whole army of spies and secret informants was created. Great attention was paid to irrigation and agriculture. The state built canals and roads to facilitate the movement of troops and trade. At that time, the Indian army was considered the most formidable force in Asia. Its ranks included hundreds of thousands of infantrymen, cavalry, and, most importantly, thousands of war elephants, which inspired terror in any enemy. After the death of Chandragupta and the reign of his son Bindusara, Ashoka ascended the throne. His name means without sorrow, but the first half of his reign was overshadowed by cruel wars. Ashoka sought to expand the empire's borders, and in the 8th year of his reign, he undertook a campaign against the state of Kalinga on the eastern coast. The battle was incredibly bloody. Legends say that after the battle, the Daya River turned red from the blood of the fallen warriors. Tens of thousands of people died, even more were taken prisoner. Seeing the scale of destruction and human grief, Ashoka experienced deep shock. Instead of triumph, he felt remorse that completely changed his worldview. He decided to forever abandon wars of conquest and turn to the teachings of the Buddha. Ashoka became the first ruler in history to make the principles of non-violence and compassion the basis of state policy. Instead of the power of the sword, he proclaimed the victory of Dharma, victory through righteousness and virtue. To preach his ideas, Ashoka began to erect huge stone pillars throughout the empire and carve edicts on rocks. These inscriptions have survived to this day. In them, the king addressed his subjects as a father to children. He called on people to respect their parents, show mercy to servants, be tolerant of other beliefs, and not kill animals unnecessarily. Ashoka built hospitals not only for people, but also for animals. Along the roads, he ordered trees to be planted for shade, wells to be dug, and rest houses for travelers to be built. Special attention was paid to the spread of Buddhism. He convened the Third Buddhist Council in Pataliputra to purify the teaching from distortions.
On his initiative, monk missionaries were sent to distant countries, to Sri Lanka, Burma, Central Asia, and even to the Greek kingdoms of the Mediterranean. Thanks to this activity, the local Indian teaching began to turn into a world religion. At the same time, Ashoka remained a wise ruler and did not impose faith by force. He supported both Brahmins and Jains, asserting that honoring another's faith only strengthens one's own. The Maurya era became a time of unprecedented development of art and architecture. Ashoka's stone pillars, with their perfectly polished surfaces and lion capitals, became a symbol of Indian statehood. It is the image of 4 lions from one of these pillars that is today the emblem of modern India. The construction of great stupas began, dome-shaped structures for storing sacred relics. The most famous of them, the stupa in Sanchi, amazes with its harmony and elegant stone carving. The economy of the empire prospered thanks to stability and security. The great main road laid by the Mauryas connected the east and west of the country, contributing to the rapid exchange of goods and ideas. Ships from distant countries docked in the ports of India, bringing exotic goods and taking away Indian spices, fabrics, and precious stones. Pataliputra, surrounded by powerful walls with towers, was a symbol of wealth and civilization. Education and literacy were encouraged, and theaters and philosophical schools flourished in the cities. However, after the death of Ashoka, the empire gradually began to weaken. His successors did not possess the same authority and wisdom. Huge expenses for maintaining officials and a huge army became a heavy burden on the treasury. Remote provinces began to declare their independence, and the borders became vulnerable to raids by northern nomads. In the 2nd century BCE, the last ruler of the Maurya dynasty was killed by his military commander, and the great empire finally collapsed.
Despite the fall of the state, the legacy of the Mauryas remained alive in the memory of the people. They showed an example of how a huge and diverse country can live under a single law. Ashoka's ideals of humane governance and the ruler's social responsibility became the standard for all subsequent generations. The era of iron and conquests was replaced by a time of deep spiritual changes. India entered a period of fragmentation, but this period only prepared the ground for a new cultural explosion that would occur several centuries later, when the time of great discoveries in science and art would come. After several centuries of fragmentation and political instability, in the 4th century CE, India reunited under the rule of a strong dynasty. The rulers of the Gupta family managed to create a state that historians rightly call the Golden Age of Indian civilization. This was a time when material well-being, political power, and an unprecedented rise of human genius coincided at one point in history. India of this period became a true beacon of knowledge and culture for the entire ancient world, influencing neighboring countries and future generations of scientists. The founder of the dynasty was Chandragupta I, who wisely combined military force with diplomatic marriages. His son, Samudragupta, often called the poet on the throne, expanded the empire's borders from the Himalayas to the shores of the Bay of Bengal. However, the state reached the peak of its power under Chandragupta II, known as Vikramaditya. At this time, a period of peace and security was established in India, which allowed people to focus on creation. Travelers from China who visited the country in those years described it as a land where there are no cruel executions and the people live in prosperity and harmony. The main achievement of the Gupta era was a revolutionary breakthrough in mathematics. It was at this time that Indian scientists gave humanity the numeral system we use today. The most outstanding mathematician of that time was Aryabhata. He introduced the concept of zero as an independent number, which made it possible to perform the most complex calculations with incredible ease. Before this, mathematical calculations in other cultures were extremely cumbersome. Aryabhata also calculated the value of the number pi with high accuracy and developed methods for extracting square and cubic roots. Without these discoveries, modern physics, engineering, and even computer technology would have been impossible. Astronomy in the Golden Age also reached astonishing heights. The same Aryabhata, 1,000 years before European scientists, put forward the theory that the Earth is a sphere and rotates around its axis. He correctly explained the causes of solar and lunar eclipses, proving that these are merely shadows falling on celestial bodies and not the tricks of mythical dragons. Another great scientist of that time, Varahamihira, systematized knowledge about the movement of planets and stars. Indian observatories of that time were advanced scientific centers where regular observations of the sky were conducted. Scientific successes were accompanied by the development of medicine and chemistry. In the Gupta era, Indian doctors already mastered techniques of complex surgical operations, including plastic surgery of the nose and cataract removal. They used hundreds of medicinal plants and minerals to treat diseases. Indian metallurgists achieved such mastery that they created the famous Iron Pillar in Delhi. This structure, more than 7 meters high, has stood in the open air for more than 1,600 years and is practically not subject to corrosion. The secret of the composition of this metal still arouses admiration and debate among modern engineers. Literature in the Sanskrit language reached its perfection during this period. The court of Chandragupta was adorned by the 9 gems, the greatest cultural figures of that time. Among them was the poet and playwright Kalidasa, often called the Indian Shakespeare. His poems and plays, such as Shakuntala, are filled with deep lyricism and a subtle understanding of the human soul. At the same time, the great epic tales, Mahabharata and Ramayana, were finally edited and written down. These works became not just books, but the basis of the cultural and spiritual unity of the Indian people. The visual art and architecture of the Gupta era were distinguished by refinement and calm grandeur. It was then that the classical canons of Indian temple architecture took shape. The walls of the cave temples in Ajanta were decorated with magnificent frescoes that have preserved their bright colors to this day. On these paintings, the world of ancient India comes to life. Kings and beggars, heavenly dancers and forest animals. Sculptors of that time learned to convey in stone the state of deep meditation and inner peace. The images of the Buddha and Hindu deities created by the masters of the Sarnath school are considered the pinnacle of plastic art. Education was available to many, and India was famous for its universities. The most famous of them was Nalanda, a huge monastic complex where thousands of students from all over Asia studied. Here, they studied not only religious texts, but also logic, grammar, medicine, and philosophy. The huge libraries of Nalanda stored hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Teachers and students lived in an atmosphere of constant discussions and the search for truth. This university was a symbol of India's intellectual openness, which gladly shared its knowledge with the whole world. During the Gupta era, the modern form of Hinduism finally took shape. The old Vedic traditions were transformed into more accessible forms of worship of the great gods Vishnu, Shiva, and Devi. Majestic stone temples began to be built, which became centers of public and cultural life. At the same time, religious tolerance was maintained. Buddhism and Jainism continued to flourish alongside Hinduism, receiving support from the rulers. Religious life was filled with holidays, music, and dances, which became an integral part of the national character. The empire's economy relied on prosperous agriculture and extensive maritime trade. Indian merchants actively developed the markets of Southeast Asia, bringing there not only goods, but also their culture, writing, and religion. India's influence during this period spread to the territory of modern Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia. Gupta gold coins with images of kings were recognized as currency over vast spaces. The country was rich and the cities were well maintained. However, by the middle of the 5th century, new nomadic tribes, the Huns, appeared on the northern borders of the empire. Their frequent and cruel raids began to deplete the state's resources. Internal strife between heirs and the weakening of central power led to the fact that outlying provinces began to separate. By the middle of the 6th century, the great Gupta Empire collapsed into small principalities. The Golden Age came to an end, but its legacy became the eternal foundation of Indian identity. The knowledge created in that era did not disappear. It was preserved in books and traditions to later become the basis for new achievements of humanity. India froze in anticipation of new shocks that would be brought by warriors from distant Western lands. By the end of the first millennium CE, the political map of India again represented a mosaic of warring principalities. At this time, a new, formidable force began to grow on the northwestern borders of the subcontinent. Islam, born in the sands of Arabia, began its rapid advance to the east. The first clashes were in the nature of predatory raids, but gradually the intentions of the conquerors changed. They came not just for gold, but to establish their own states on these rich lands. This was the beginning of a long and complex process of collision and interaction between two completely different civilizations. At the beginning of the 13th century in northern India, a state arose that went down in history as the Delhi Sultanate. Its founder was Qutbuddin Aibak, a former slave warrior. He proclaimed Delhi his capital and began the construction of great monuments as a sign of his triumph. The most famous of them was the Qutub Minar, the tallest brick minaret in the world. This structure was supposed to symbolize the power of the new faith and the authority of the sultans. From this moment, for 3 centuries, Delhi became the political and cultural center where 5 successive Muslim dynasties ruled. The arrival of the new power was a huge shock for traditional Indian society. 2 opposite value systems clashed. Islam preached equality of all believers before God, while Hinduism relied on a strict hierarchy of castes. Islam forbade the depiction of living beings, while Indian temples were covered with thousands of statues of people and deities. In the first decades of the conquests, many ancient monuments were destroyed. However, the history of India has always been a history of absorbing and transforming external influences. Over time, the period of destruction was replaced by a period of creative synthesis. The sultans of Delhi sought to expand their possessions to the south and east. The most ambitious and controversial ruler of that time was Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He possessed brilliant education and a broad outlook, but his methods of governance were often cruel and ill-considered. Once he ordered the entire population of Delhi to move to a new capital in the south, which led to the death of thousands of people. His attempts to introduce paper money and change the tax system also ended in failure. Despite this, under him, the Sultanate reached its maximum borders, covering almost the entire subcontinent. However, it was impossible to hold such a huge territory by force of arms alone, and soon uprisings began. Despite wars and political intrigues, the era of the Sultanate became a time of the birth of a new, unique culture. Indian masters began to work for Muslim rulers, combining their ancient traditions with new architectural forms. Thus, the Indo-Islamic style emerged. Buildings with high domes, slender arches, and exquisite stone carvings appeared, depicting not gods, but complex plant patterns and calligraphy. Cities began to change their appearance. Mosques, mausoleums, and public baths were built in them. New construction technologies brought from Central Asia and Persia made it possible to erect larger and more durable structures. The economy of this period continued to develop thanks to the expansion of trade relations. India became an important link in world trade, connecting China and Southeast Asia with the Middle East and Europe. New goods and technologies poured into the country. Paper production appeared. The use of spinning wheels began, which significantly accelerated the manufacture of fabrics. Indian cotton and spices were valued at their weight in gold. Crafts flourished in the cities, and the markets of Delhi were famous for their abundance. The sultans minted silver coins called tanka, which became the basis of the region's monetary system. One of the most amazing phenomena of this era was spiritual synthesis. In Islam, a movement called Sufism emerged, a mystical direction that preached love for God and the rejection of external formalities. Sufi saints settled in simple huts and were open to people of any origin. Their ideas turned out to be very close to the Indian Bhakti movement, the path of personal devotion to the deity. Hindu and Muslim mystics often found a common language, asserting that truth is one and the paths to it may be different. This led to the appearance of new poets and preachers who wrote in local languages and called for peace and brotherhood. The linguistic environment also underwent changes. On the basis of a mixture of Persian, Arabic, and local Indian dialects, the Urdu language began to form. It became the language of the army and markets, and later of great poetry. New genres appeared in literature, and Persian chronicles and historical works gave us the opportunity to study the events of those years in detail. Indian scientists and poets began translating ancient Sanskrit texts into Persian, opening the wisdom of India to the entire Islamic world. It was a period of active intellectual exchange that enriched both sides. However, the life of ordinary people remained difficult. Constant wars between sultans and raids by nomads devastated villages. At the end of the 14th century, India was struck by a terrible disaster, the invasion of Timur. The great conqueror from Samarkand burst into Delhi, leaving ruins and mountains of bodies behind. This event dealt the Sultanate a blow from which it could no longer recover. Central power weakened, and independent states arose on the outskirts, such as the Bahmani Sultanate in the south or the prosperous kingdom of Gujarat in the west. At the same time, in southern India, the powerful Vijayanagara Empire grew stronger, becoming a stronghold of Hindu culture and traditions. The 15th century became a time of gradual decline of the Delhi Sultanate. The last dynasties, the Sayyids and Lodis, controlled only small territories around the capital. Internal strife and dissatisfaction of the nobility made the country vulnerable to a new threat from the north. Despite the political decline, the seeds of culture sown in this period gave rich shoots. India was no longer the same. It became a place where the fates of millions of people of different faiths intertwined. It was a complex and sometimes painful experience of coexistence that prepared the ground for the emergence of a new great force. Thus ended the era of the Delhi Sultans. It left behind magnificent monuments, a new language, and a unique social fabric. India passed through the test of fire and sword, preserving its soul and enriching it with new colors. On the threshold stood the 16th century, and with it a new conqueror who would come from the mountains of Afghanistan to found one of the most brilliant empires in world history. In 1526, the history of India took another sharp turn. From the north, from the valleys of modern Afghanistan, came the army of Babur, a descendant of the great conquerors Timur and Genghis Khan. Possessing a small but disciplined army and artillery, a weapon never seen before in India, Babur defeated the troops of the Delhi Sultan in the Battle of Panipat. This marked the beginning of the Mughal Empire, which for 2 centuries became synonymous with unimaginable wealth, refined taste, and absolute power. The word Mughal itself became a common noun in Europe to denote a person of fabulous power. However, the true architect of the empire was Babur's grandson, Akbar, nicknamed the Great. He ascended the throne at the age of 13 and, during his long reign, turned the conquered lands into a single and powerful state organism. Akbar understood that it was impossible to govern a huge country relying only on the power of the sword and the faith of a minority. He began to pursue a policy of broad religious tolerance. Akbar abolished the tax on non-Muslims and began to attract local Hindu princes, the Rajputs, to govern the state. His court in the city of Agra became a place where philosophers of different religions could hold open discussions in the presence of the emperor himself. Akbar carried out deep reforms that ensured the empire's stability for decades to come. He introduced a clear system of military ranks and civil positions, established fair land taxes, and created an effective bureaucratic apparatus. Under him, a cultural flourishing began that combined Persian refinement and Indian passion. The Mughal school of miniature became known throughout the world for its detailed and lively depictions of court life, hunting, and nature. The emperor himself could not read, but possessed a huge library and forced courtiers to read to him aloud every evening. Akbar's heirs continued his work, turning India into the richest country of that time. Akbar's son, Jahangir, was a great patron of the arts and a passionate lover of nature. He laid out magnificent gardens in Kashmir, which still amaze with their beauty to this day. However, the peak of architectural greatness was achieved under his son, Emperor Shah Jahan. It was by his order that the Taj Mahal was erected in Agra, a mausoleum made of dazzling white marble built in memory of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. This structure was built over more than 20 years by the forces of 20,000 workers and became a symbol of India throughout the world. Shah Jahan also moved the capital to Delhi, where he built the Red Fort and the huge Jama Masjid Mosque. The era of the great Mughals was a time of fantastic luxury. Emperors sat on the peacock throne, which was studded with thousands of precious stones, including the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond. Trade flourished, and European merchants, Portuguese, English, and Dutch, sought permission to trade in India. The country supplied the world market with silk, spices, and the finest cotton fabrics, which in Europe were valued above gold. India during this period produced almost a quarter of all world production, being a real economic superpower of the 16th to 17th centuries. However, dark clouds began to gather behind the brilliance of the palaces. The last great emperor was Aurangzeb, son of Shah Jahan. He was a talented military commander and a stern ascetic, but his policy sharply differed from the views of his ancestors. Aurangzeb abandoned Akbar's religious tolerance and returned harsh taxes for non-Muslims. He destroyed many Hindu temples and tried to impose his orders by force in all corners of the country. Although under him the empire's territory reached its maximum, internal unity was undermined. Constant wars in the south depleted the treasury and the army's strength. Powerful uprisings began to rise against the Mughals. In the mountains of western India, a new force emerged, the Marathas, under the leadership of the talented leader Shivaji. They used guerrilla warfare tactics and soon created their own powerful state. In the north, the Sikhs, a community of warriors and thinkers who did not want to submit to religious oppression, declared themselves. Central power in Delhi weakened with each year. Aurangzeb spent the last 25 years of his life on campaigns, trying to suppress rebellions, but only accelerated the decline of the state. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the empire began to rapidly disintegrate. His heirs waged endless wars for the throne, becoming puppets in the hands of influential court factions. Huge provinces such as Bengal, Hyderabad, and Awadh actually became independent, only formally recognizing the power of the Delhi emperors. In 1739, India suffered a crushing blow. The Persian ruler, Nadir Shah, captured and plundered Delhi. He took away from the country the fabulous treasures accumulated over 2 centuries. After this blow, the Mughals were never able to restore their former greatness. While Indian rulers feuded among themselves, Europeans felt more and more confident on the shores of the subcontinent. If earlier they were only modest petitioners at the emperor's court, now they saw the opportunity to turn their trading posts into strongholds for seizing power. The East India Companies of England and France began to actively intervene in the conflicts of local princes, providing them with their trained soldiers and modern weapons in exchange for land and privileges. The old order was crumbling before our eyes, and the new one was not yet clear to contemporaries. The era of the great Mughals left behind a contradictory but grandiose legacy. They gave India majestic architecture, refined cuisine, music, and poetry, which became an integral part of national culture. At the same time, their fall became a lesson of how the lack of internal agreement and religious intolerance can destroy even the most powerful power. The emperors in Delhi still continued to sit on the throne, but their power was now limited to the walls of their own palace. India stood on the threshold of a new, more complex era, in which it would have to face the power of European industrial civilization. In the middle of the 18th century, India turned into an arena of struggle, not only between local rulers, but also between the largest European powers. The English East India Company, originally created for simple spice trade, gradually turned into a powerful political and military organization. In 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, the British established control over the richest province of Bengal. This event became the beginning of a 100-year process during which the trading company, step by step, subjugated the entire subcontinent. Using the enmity between Indian princes and superiority in armament, the British turned India into their main colony. The first century of British rule was a time of harsh exploitation of the country's resources. Indian goods, once famous throughout the world, began to be displaced by cheap products from British factories.
Traditional weaving production fell into decline, leading to the ruin of millions of artisans. Discontent grew in the country, which in 1857 erupted into a large-scale uprising known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Indian soldiers serving in the colonial army took up arms against their officers. The rebellion engulfed all of northern India and lasted more than a year. After its suppression, the British Crown decided to liquidate the East India Company and take control of India into its own hands. Thus began the era of British Raj. The British brought elements of Western civilization to India, but did so primarily to strengthen their power. A network of railways was built, which became one of the longest in the world. Telegraph lines and the modern postal service appeared. The British introduced their education and justice system, hoping to create a layer of educated Indians who would be loyal to the empire. However, it was this education that became the catalyst for change. Familiarity with European ideas of freedom and equality forced the Indian intelligentsia to think about the fate of their own homeland. The Indian National Congress was created in the country, an organization that over time led the struggle for independence. At the beginning of the 20th century, the national movement received new impetus with the return to his homeland of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi, whom the people would later call Mahatma, meaning great soul, offered the world a completely new way of struggle. He developed the philosophy of satyagraha, the tactics of peaceful civil disobedience. Gandhi argued that injustice can be fought without hatred and weapons. He called on Indians to refuse British goods, not to pay colonial taxes, and to ignore the orders of the authorities. His personal example of modesty and commitment to truth united millions of people, from rich merchants to the poorest peasants. One of the brightest episodes of this struggle was the Salt March in 1930. The British introduced a monopoly on salt extraction, which painfully hit the poorest segments of the population. Gandhi, together with his followers, walked hundreds of kilometers to the ocean coast to demonstratively evaporate a pinch of salt from seawater. This simple gesture became a powerful symbol of disobedience that resounded throughout the world. The British authorities were at a loss in the face of millions of people who were ready to go to prison but did not use violence in response to baton blows. World War II accelerated the process of the collapse of the colonial system. The British Empire was exhausted by the war and could no longer maintain control over the huge and seething India. By the mid-1940s, it became obvious that independence was inevitable. However, the joy of approaching freedom was overshadowed by a deep internal split. Serious disagreements arose between the leaders of the Hindu community and the Muslim League regarding the future state structure. The Muslim League demanded the creation of a separate state for Muslims, Pakistan. Despite all Gandhi's efforts to preserve the unity of the country, Britain decided to divide the subcontinent along religious lines. On August 15, 1947, India officially gained independence. The first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, delivered his famous speech about the tryst with destiny. But this historic moment was accompanied by the greatest tragedy. The partition of the country led to mass migrations of millions of people who found themselves on the wrong side of the border. Outbreaks of violence between communities claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Mahatma Gandhi himself, who tried to stop the madness and called for peace, was killed by a fanatic in January 1948. This was a heavy blow to the young nation, which was just beginning its independent path. British rule left a complex legacy. On the one hand, India inherited state borders, a modern administrative structure, and the English language, which became a means of communication between different states. On the other hand, the country faced the consequences of colonial policy, which left behind deep poverty and illiteracy of the population.
Britain exported enormous wealth from the country, turning a once prosperous agrarian power into a dependent raw materials appendage. The path to economic recovery promised to be long and difficult. Nevertheless, having gained independence, India chose the path of democracy. One of the most detailed constitutions in the world was adopted, which guaranteed rights and freedoms to all citizens, regardless of their caste or religion. A country where hundreds of languages are spoken and thousands of gods are worshipped began to build a single civil nation. It was a unique experiment that the whole world watched with interest and apprehension.
The Indians proved that freedom is not just the absence of colonizers, but above all, responsibility for their future. Thus ended the chapter of colonial history. India threw off the shackles of British Raj, paying a high price for it. The huge subcontinent entered an era of great hopes and grandiose plans. The young republic had to find its place in a changing world, solve the problem of hunger, and begin industrialization while preserving its ancient traditions and cultural diversity. Ahead lay the path to the stars and technological heights that would make India one of the most dynamic countries of the 21st century. Gaining independence in 1947 became for India not only a moment of triumph, but also the beginning of titanic work to recreate the country. The first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, saw the future state as a combination of ancient traditions and achievements of modern science. He called factories, power plants, and scientific institutes the temples of the new India. From the first days, the Republic took a course toward industrialization and self-sufficiency. It was a bold challenge for a country that, at the time of the British departure, was in a state of deep economic exhaustion. One of the main victories of the young Republic was the Green Revolution, which began in the 1960s. Thanks to the introduction of new grain varieties and modern irrigation methods, India was able to completely solve the problem of mass hunger in a short time. A country that for decades had depended on food supplies from abroad became a major grain exporter itself. This success proved that Indian science is capable of solving the most acute social problems. At the same time, heavy industry developed, giant dams were built, and the foundations of nuclear energy were laid, which was supposed to provide energy to millions of homes. In the late 20th century, India experienced another large-scale transformation, the economic reforms of 1991.
By abandoning rigid state control, the country opened its doors to the world market. This led to an explosive growth of private entrepreneurship and the emergence of a powerful middle class. It was during this period that the transformation of India into a global center of information technology began. The city of Bangalore turned into the Indian Silicon Valley, where software products for the world's largest corporations are created. Today, Indian programmers and engineers are considered among the best in the world, and the export of digital services has become the most important item of state revenue. A special reason for national pride was the space program. India proved that it can conquer space using its own technologies and at the same time spending funds much more efficiently than other countries. In 2014, an Indian spacecraft successfully entered Mars orbit on its first attempt, which became a sensation in the global scientific community. Quite recently, the whole world held its breath watching the Chandrayaan-3 mission, during which an Indian lunar rover made the first soft landing in history in the region of the Moon's south pole. These successes confirmed India's status as a leading space power of the 21st century. Modern India is a country of incredible contrasts, where the latest technologies coexist with rituals that are thousands of years old. In megacities such as Mumbai and Delhi, glass skyscrapers and modern metro overpasses surround ancient temples and noisy oriental bazaars. Indian cinema, known under the brand Bollywood, has long gone beyond the country,
becoming a powerful tool of cultural influence. The songs and dances of the Indian screen find resonance in the hearts of millions of people around the world, from Nigeria to Russia. This is soft power that helps the world better understand the complex and multifaceted Indian soul. Despite rapid progress, the country still faces serious challenges.
India is the most populous country in the world, which requires constant efforts to create new jobs, develop medicine and education. Solving the problem of inequality and preserving the environment in the conditions of rapid growth of cities are tasks that the best minds of the Republic are working on. India strives to ensure a decent life for every citizen, while maintaining a fragile balance between industrial development and environmental protection. An important feature of modern India remains its commitment to democratic values. Regular elections, in which hundreds of millions of voters participate, are the largest democratic process on earth. Despite all the ethnic and religious diversity, the country maintains unity, relying on its constitution and faith in a common future. India actively participates in solving global problems, whether climate change or issues of international security, acting as the voice of the developing world.
Education has become the main social elevator for millions of young Indians. Indian institutes of technology annually graduate specialists who are hunted by leading companies around the world. However, many of them now prefer to stay at home or return from abroad to develop their own startups in India. Faith in their own strengths and entrepreneurial spirit have become the hallmark of the new generation, which is not afraid to compete at the global level. The history of India is a history of continuity. The civilization that arose in the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago did not disappear like many other ancient cultures. It transformed, absorbed the new, went through periods of decline and greatness, but always preserved its foundation. The Vedas, the teachings of the Buddha, the philosophy of ahimsa, and the striving for truth still live in the minds of modern Indians. This deep-rootedness in the past gives the country the stability necessary for moving into the future.
India of the 21st century is not only a country of spices and yoga, but also a country of quantum computing, renewable energy, and advanced medicine. It follows its own path without blindly copying other models of development. It is in this search for its own place in the world that the uniqueness of the Indian experience lies. Watching how the country launches rockets to the moon and at the same time celebrates ancient festivals of lights, one realizes that India has always been and remains a whole world enclosed within the borders of one subcontinent. The path of India continues. This is an endless road of discoveries, where each turn can bring something amazing. The history we have studied is only a prologue to the great future that this nation is building right now. India remains forever young and forever wise, inviting everyone who is ready to listen to touch its inexhaustible magic and wisdom. However, behind this brilliant facade of progress lies a bitter truth.
By 2026, the internal contradictions that had been accumulating for centuries, religious tensions, caste inequality, and the environmental crisis had reached a critical point. Massive climate catastrophes, exacerbated by overpopulation, brought millions of people to the brink of survival. Uprisings that erupted simultaneously in different parts of the country, along with political chaos, threatened the very existence of a united India. The great civilization that had survived 5 millennia now risked shattering into warring fragments, just as it had in its darkest periods. A history full of rises may end in a tragic fall. Unless the new generation finds the strength within itself to revive the ancient wisdom of unity.